and that is required to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. But this is a very, very challenging target, and it won't be possible to reach that goal unless we have a well planned out trajectory. And in the course of mapping the road towards net zero, it has become increasingly evident that one has to address scope 3 emissions, and an important strategy for that is to look at your supply chain, for large companies to look at the supply chain and decarbonize the supply chain. So value chain decarbonization often offers immense opportunities for companies to achieve their net zero commitments. And it facilitates companies to use their influence in supply chains to support, again, rapid decarbonization throughout the economy. So this panel discussion aims at deliberating the methods and tools to be deployed for decarbonizing the value chain. And we have 4 eminent panelists. I have the pleasure of introducing them. We will first hear from Mr. Bipin Odekar, who is the Head of Operations Excellence and Sustainability at Marico Limited. He plays a key role in developing and implementing sustainability pathway for Marico, including strategy, targets, and governance mechanisms for disclosures. He will be followed by Mr. Prabodha Acharya, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSW Group. He drives the development of the sustainability strategy and ESG performances for the JSW Group companies. Our third speaker today, third panelist, is Mr. Amit Agarwal. He's a corporate strategy specialist for sustainability and mobility at the BMW Group. He has been driving BMW Group's strategy at the crossroads between circular economy and electric vehicles. And finally, we have Mr. Gautam R.K., who is the Director of Sustainability at Cushman & Wakefield, India. He has been actively associated with green and smart building projects for over a decade and has keenly pursued technological advancements in the building industry. So let us move first to Mr. Bipin Odekar, who's the Head of Operations Excellence and Sustainability at Marico Limited. May I ask you to share your perspectives on decarbonization of the value chain in specific reference to your industry? Over to you, Mr. Odekar.
Thank you, Mr. Ram, and thanks to CII for organizing this event. I think all such kind of events are extremely useful platform for all members to understand what are the different practices going on in industry and how they can be horizontally deployed in their own organizations. I represent Marico. We are an FMCG company, and I think everybody understand that each industry has its own distribution of carbon emissions. Cement, textiles, even in railways, everybody has a different distribution of scope 1, 2, and 3. And then decarbonization plan will vary based on the industry you operate in. In a typical FMCG industry like us, scope 1 and 2 are definitely important, but scope 3 plays very important role because the sheer size of scope 3 is quite higher than scope 1 and 2. We started our practices in sustainability long back in 2009-10 when we started with the purpose of the organization. And then eventually 2012-13 became our baseline year where we started inventorizing carbon for Marico. And then every year we have taken different initiatives and programs to reduce carbon and GHG emissions from our operations. I would like to tell you that this has been a very decent journey for Marico. Till last year, we have reduced almost 81% of our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And overall, especially the big jump has happened in thermal energy reduction. Most of the places where we have moved from fossil fuel to biofuels. And electricity also, there is a very good jump, you can say, by usage of wind and solar energy. So overall, scope 1 and 2 journey has been very important for us. But as we're moving ahead, we understood that the material issues are related to value chain, and then a lot of work has to be done in that area. So if you look at the scope 3 emissions for Marico, predominant emissions are coming from materials, raw materials and packaging material we use it. Second would be the logistic, which plays a very important role, upstream and downstream logistics. So we started working on how these things can be tackled up, and three important programs we come up with these things. First program is definitely on working on logistic footprint. So we did a complete mapping of our manufacturing footprint and then the sales center of gravities. And last year, we started a journey that can we look at reconfiguration of our warehouses and manufacturing units so that overall movement in terms of raw materials and finished goods can go down. And then a good amount of initiatives were taken in last 18 to 20 months. And happy to share with you, all of you, that we could actually observe around 13% reduction in logistic emissions, downstream and upstream put together. And we feel that there could be few more opportunities in this space by doing some innovations in the way we do manufacturing. Probably that could be the area we will explore in as we are moving ahead. Second, I spoke about materials. We are the largest buyer of coconuts in India. So it becomes our, I think, a moral duty also to work for overall coconut cultivation in India and for the farmers and agri community who operates in this space. So we took a program called as Kalpvriksha. I think everybody understands Kalpvriksha is the name given to a coconut tree. So the programs aims at doing scientific way of cultivation for coconut. So we have agricultural experts on our boards who actually visit farms and then help them to understand what kind of farming practices they should have, whether it is about soil management, pesticide management, water management, or disease management, etc. And all these things have created a very good improvement in overall productivity, the way water management has to be done. So there's a reduction we observed in those cases also. And now recently, few more experiments and model farms are created where we observed that because of biomass increase and because of these things, overall carbon emissions are also going down. So there's an internal case study which is available with us. So which with these things, we feel that if this program, as of now, around 40,000 farmers are involved with us. If we take this to a larger base in India, I think overall coconut farming and cultivation industries is very big in India. So if this kind of practices are taken to every farmer, there is probably a big opportunity to reduce carbon in agricultural space also. Third thing, we started something called as a circular economy program for Marico. So as of although circular economy is a very vast concept, but now it is limited to plastics. Being an FMCG company, we are the people who we are using the highest amount of plastics probably because every product is packaged in plastics, and that's the reason we took this program. So it has got four elements. One is definitely on a design phase. So at every design which will come out should have some element of reduction of plastics and should intend help us to remove carbon at the design stage itself. Last year we did around 5 projects and we could reduce around 450 tons of carbon from the design phase itself. Second element is usage of recycled plastic in our portfolio. There's a dual impact. So you can actually reduce the waste by recycling it from society, and then it can also help to reduce usage of virgin plastics from your portfolio. And we are moving over towards a sustainable packaging. It's our commitment to ensure recyclable packaging portfolio by 2025. As of now, we are at 95%, and hopefully we should move to 100% by 2025. So these are the broad areas or the broad themes we are working on. I'm sure that scope 1 and scope 2 should not be a big challenge for us. Another 7 to 8 years, we should be in a position to move towards carbon neutrality. One of our plant in Perandura is already certified as carbon neutral, and hopefully other manufacturing units also should follow the path. So that's overall, I could say I can summarize Marico's efforts in this space. and would be happy to learn from other eminent speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Odekar. We will come back to you after we finish the one round of the panelists. So now we have Mr. Prabodha Acharya, the Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSW Group. May I request him to share his thoughts?
Thank
Mr.
you.
Acharya, you are muted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abraham. Good morning to everybody. This is a very interesting question. Now, if you look at, it has been already 5 years since world adopted Paris Agreement, and now we are going to COP26 in Glasgow. So it's a good time to discuss this issue. But most importantly, we have to ask ourselves about the progress that we have made against what was expected out of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And we could see a growing number of countries and companies now committing to net zero targets, and that's very encouraging. And you would have seen in India also, voluntarily 26 companies last time came together and put their net zero targets commitment, and JSW was one of them. So, however, at this moment, this commitment need to be urgently translated into very strong near-term policies and action. So, in a sense, I would like to say net zero carbon is not a race where a company or country wins it. The intent of net zero carbon can be achieved when everyone wins it, because this is a global problem. So that being said, to understand the term net zero, put simply, that means we are not adding new emission to the atmosphere. So emission will continue, specifically in a developing nation like ours, but will be balanced by absorbing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. So it's a big task. So this is, having set the context of the net zero, let me come back to the question what you asked in the beginning about what we as a group, we as a business are doing specifically towards the scope 3. As you know, JSW Group is in the manufacturing sector, and we are in all hard to abate sector. We are in steel, we are in energy, we are in cement, and we are in the infrastructure. So obviously the spotlight is on us. And that is where our responsibility comes into play. And look, JSW is better known as a steel maker to the country. So steel is contributing almost 0.7% of the global GDP, but at the same time, we are contributing almost 7% of the global emission. And that's quite huge, and that's not proportionate, and that's not fair. But if you look at the emission profile, only 2 to 3% is coming from the scope 3 in the globally. But we are responsible for scope 3 emissions of the companies like Amit. So if I reduce my emissions, Amit will be happy, because he could possibly reduce his scope 3 emissions. And if you look at JSW, our scope 3 emissions is hardly less than 1% of the total emissions. So therefore, our focus has been to reduce both our direct and energy indirect emissions, and that's where we have set a very aggressive target to reduce 42% by 2030, because 2030 is a visible target date where we have the visibility. We know what is the technology available, how it is going to play, and that's the reason we set the target for 2030 instead of putting a very long-term target, which will be very difficult to really visualize how we can achieve those. And it is also aligned with our NDCs. But at the same time, if you look at the energy sector, which our JSW Energy, and that is the if you look at maximum emissions are being contributed from the energy sector, and we have a clear visibility, we set a target of being carbon neutral by 2050. So all our business, we have set our targets. Even in one of the steel sector, that is our downstream steel industry, which we call coated business, we have set a target to become carbon neutral by 2030. But Avram, you talked about achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 in your opening statement. I just want to give my perspective with respect to Indian iron and steel operations. And that is where I believe we need to recognize the fact and the challenges this sector faces. And it's called to hard to abate, because it is not simply by energy transition we can achieve our objective. Therefore, I believe Indian iron and steel sector should follow IA sustainable development scenario, where we make significant reduction our emissions by 2050. And if you go by recommendations of IA, by almost 60% reductions, with the objective that we should achieve net zero, no, not be, not later than 2070, so that we are aligned at least to the 2-degree scenario, which is pragmatic, very ambitious, considering the growth ambitions of our nation and the raw material which we are available. But at the same time, I promise, Amit, we will be reducing our emissions so that you can demonstrate that you are reducing your scope 3 emissions. I'll be happy to take further questions in the follow-ups, but that will be my opening statement. I remain here, and I look forward to discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Acharya. You have highlighted the challenges facing the steel industry, and I am sure that the challenges facing some of the other hard to abate sectors are the same. But let us move now to Mr. Amit Agrawal, who's the Corporate Strategy Specialist, Sustainability for the BMW Group, and hear from him. Over to you, Mr. Agrawal.
Mr. Stefanos. You can just call me Amit. It just goes simpler. I think a couple of remarks, and thanks so much, Mr. Acharya, for setting the stage. One thing that you cannot help notice is when we say scope 1, 2, 3, and my scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 and 2. So we really are, as Mr. Acharya put it, he hit the nail on the head, that unless we talk across industries, we will not be able to achieve this reduction, because everybody will point fingers to each other. I'm clean, I do my scope 1 and 2, scope 3 somebody else's problem, and that's not the way to look at it. I think the other is a question of choice versus vision, right? So if you look at the major markets, at least for a BMW or even for any global company today, you look at essentially US, Europe, China, and then there's, of course, the other markets are also there. And when you look at the carbon emissions of emission ambitions across these three markets, you see US is committed to going net zero by 2050. Europe is also committed to go net zero by 2050. Germany by 2045, and China has more or less said, okay, we'll make it happen by 2060 because of the development considerations. So for global companies like us, it's not a matter of choice, it's a question of survival to be net zero, right? And that's what we have committed for. So now coming to the specifics, when you look at the automotive industry and you think emissions, your first attention goes to the tailpipe. There's this little piece of pipe emitting smoke at the end of the car. And you could say, okay, the way to make automotive industry emission free is just move it to electric. So that's what we call as, in a different parlance, rather than scope 1, 2, 3, we call the tank to wheel emissions. So between the tank of the car and the wheel of the car, there should be no emissions, and the answer is electric, right? You could take this a bit further and say, okay, I also worry about where the energy comes from. So if there's a lot of coal-based electricity that's getting generated in a country or in a region, let's say Poland, India, or even in China, then you say, okay, I power my car electric, but the energy comes from coal, so I still have some emissions. So that's what we call as well-to-wheels emissions. And then the third aspect is what we call the complete life cycle assessment, which is where not only the fuel comes from, but also where the car comes from, and which brings us into the question of materials and commodities and steel and aluminum and batteries and so on. So coming to specifically what BMW is doing, and I'll again switch back to scope 1, 2, 3 terminology. So I think scope 1 and 2 for us are a small portion of the overall emission pie, and there we have a very clear defined target that against a 2019 baseline, we will reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions by 80% per vehicle by 2030. So that's on scope 1 and 2, the easy part, which is in our sphere of control, more or less. Then we come to scope 3, which is in the value chain, and there are two legs to it. One is in the use phase of the car, which is when people are driving cars, and there we have said that we would reduce scope 3 downstream emissions, that is the use phase of the car, by 50% over a baseline of 2019 across the same period. So by 2030, we want to reduce scope 3 downstream by 50%. Just last year, this target was 40%. So we revised it upwards to 50%. Now, as we transition to electric mobility, you bring in certain new elements into the car, like the battery and everything. Right? So if we're to do nothing, if we're to operate with status quo and just transition to electric, our scope 3 upstream emissions, which go into the battery industry, into the steel industry, into the aluminum industry, and so on, would have increased by 40% in the next 10 years. That is from a 2019 baseline to 2030. And there we have set ourselves a target of actually reducing it by 20%. So we are going against a natural organic rise of 40 and saying we'll not only avoid the 40, but we'll actually bring it down by 20 more. And therefore we have a scope 3 upstream emission reduction target of minus 20%. All this requires, boring through very thick barriers, because scope 3 upstream is the most challenging part, as Mr. Acharya rightly pointed out. And I think there are two ways to look at it. One is to kind of look at it in a very systemic manner. And I believe we also spoke about circular economy a bit. So when we look at the linkage of emissions, the immediate correlation is to energy. So if you clean up the energy, emissions clean up. But I think there is, in fact, a triangle of relationships between emissions, materials, and energy. And I say that because green energy, while it is clean in terms of emission friendliness, is also very material intensive. So you need much more steel, aluminum, and so on to build the green energy infrastructure, which raises the demand on the material sector, on the commodities. And that means you need to find a way to solve the problem in the process. So if your basic iron steel manufacturing process is Fe2O3 plus C is equal to carbon dioxide and iron, you cannot run with it unless you move to a different reducing agent like hydrogen, or you look at some other technologies. And that requires fundamental change, long-term change in the kind of assets and the kind of technologies that are deployed to generate the resources that we need to do this transition. I think that's where, when we look at our industry particularly, it's going through kind of a reset, I would say. So when you look at the commodities or the materials, the requirements are driven by basically lightweighting considerations. You want the car to be lighter so that it's fuel efficient. It's driven by safety standards. So if the car crashes, then you should survive in the car. So therefore it has to be high strength and everything. And then the third is, of course, the price, which is the cost of manufacturing, and now also incorporating the carbon price, which is evident in many of the markets. Now, when you look at all these three dimensions, the nature of the car is changing because it's going electric. So we are throwing a lot of stuff out, putting new stuff in. So crankshaft, which you could do with EAF steel, for example, is out. Aluminum based engine is out. A battery housing is in. So that changes the kind of choices that we make in terms of materials we use. The safety standards are moving from passive safety to active safety, which means the seat belt airbag way of cushioning you is getting augmented with intelligent automated technologies, which might do automated braking, slow down the car, and so on. So that opens up a window of opportunity. And then the relationship between primary and secondary materials, between green and non-green materials, is changing because of carbon prices. So this kind of opens a window of opportunity to relook at how a car is made and re-engineer the supply chain. What we are not certain about is how quickly the market can respond. And that's what I think I would like to discuss more and figure out in this fabulous cross-industry panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. You've poised very interesting questions for the automotive industry, which we'll come to in a moment. But now we have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Gautam R.K., who's the Director of Sustainability at Cushman & Wakefield. Please share your thoughts with us, Mr. Gautam.
Thank you, Mr. Abraham. Pleasure to be on this panel and discuss this hottest topic of the world today, net zero. Yeah, I come from a real estate background, work in a real estate consulting firm. But frankly, we don't manufacture, build, construct anything by ourselves. We help and assist our hundreds of clients globally to actually optimize their construction and operational processes. So construction industry, as you see, is both the problem and also the solution. So real estate or building industry is responsible for over 50% of the emissions over its lifetime, whether it is construction or its operations. And so it's a part of the problem, but also most of the opportunities that we have to resolve these issues or address the ever-increasing emissions globally, it's the real estate sector or the buildings that are yet to be built that probably would be the key. Though there are a lot of existing stock, that's also a different problem to deal with. But real estate, in essence, should be also part of the solution firmly. Because also real estate has at its disposal the resources, the equipment, the expertise, and also recently the investments that it requires to tackle this issue at its disposal, handy. So it's, if not real estate, who else can actually address this at a larger scale? That's one. And if not now, or if it should have been done as of yesterday, but if not now, at least today, when can we actually address this? It's too late and we may miss the bus and everything will be out of our hand or control by maybe after 2030. So we consider this decade of action 2020 to 2030 as a very important time period. It's the golden window, we call it, to address this issue. If at all we have to do something about the rising global temperatures and the runaway emissions, it is now. It is the next probably 8 years. We have already lost two years in this decade, but at least we have 8 years left. We can probably do something about it. So whether it is, we have actually identified a few areas where this can be actually be taken up. One is the technology and innovation. This is something that is lacking the construction industry for a long time to a large extent. I mean, like any other sector has coped up with technology, construction industry has not lived up to its expectations. It has not been up to speed with the rest of the world on technology adaptation. So, but there are a lot of emerging technologies on the drawing board and the implementation stages, at the trial stages, which are giving a lot of promising opportunities in this industry. A lot of manufacturing-wise efficiencies, whether it is cement or paints or steel, there are a lot of technologies that are already in place worldwide, which is supposed to be in India soon. And that can actually help us reduce the emission footprint in this industry. Similarly, there are a lot of capacity building required, upskilling required in the industry, because it's a very human-centric or very workforce-intensive industry. And nothing is standardized here. A lot of customization, a lot of ad hocism is still prevailing, not just in India, worldwide. And of course, there are a lot of good practices coming to the field, like say modularization or precast technology, and a lot of AI and ML, machine learning also coming into the picture of late. But then we also see that there's a lot of convergence that is required in this space. A lot of people are doing good work, good efforts are being put in place, but that's all in pockets of excellence. So there is a lot of sharing of good practices required, opening up of the data and the knowledge share are required, and also adding up. I mean, if I know X, you know Y, we should together we should be knowing X plus Y kind of knowledge levels. So a lot of convergence, a lot of what you call combined efforts are required, unified efforts. And of course, a lot of regulations from the government are also required in this sphere, because much of it is still recently very unorganized. So whether it is through the building, life cycle of a building, whether it is design, procurement, construction or building, operations phase of the building, and disposal or decommission of the building. Throughout this life cycle, I mean, in fact, this is building industry is a classic example of circularity. So a lot of things can go again into the system, and then there can be a lot of remanufacturing, repurposing, recycling, reusing in this building industry. So at the CNW or at Cushman & Wakefield, we are into consulting. We don't, as I said, we don't manufacture or build anything by ourselves. But since nothing much is in our scope, we also help our clients. I mean, 70% of the emissions that we talk about are from the buildings that we operate or manage for our clients. Okay, whether it is building construction management or whether it is building as an operations management. So that's where we have decided recently that we will help our clients to reduce their emissions, scope 3 emissions especially, and then get into some kind of targets. I mean, get into science-based targets by 2025, which is not very far away. And ourselves, we also committed to the global community that we will reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% at our offices and operations by 2030, which is fairly good scale. And this will be based on our 2019 baseline, because 2020 and 2021 are almost a washout for our operations, because most of it is closed as the world was also in a lockdown condition. But of course, we have also kept 2050 as our next best target of net zero emissions. So we will ensure that we'll have net zero emissions by 2050 on all scope 1, 2, 3, whether it is across our value chain and other aspects of our operations. So this is as far as Cushman & Wakefield and building industry is concerned. And over to the panel for the rest of the discussion. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Gautam. And as you mentioned, real estate, the building and construction industry accounts for about 50% of the emissions over the lifetime. And it is a real big challenge for the industry to move towards a different path as far as emissions are concerned. In a little while, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just imagine what their industry and their supply chain would be like in 2050. So it's just a pure imagination exercise. So while I give you some time to think about it, I will quickly summarize for our audience some of the key points that the panelists mentioned. Mr. Bipin Odekar from Marico, he talked about scope 3 emissions becoming a big part of their overall emissions, and the work they have done in addressing the manufacturing side as the largest buyer of coconuts through the Kalpavriksha program, and reducing the logistics carbon footprint by 30% by reconfiguring their factory warehouse distribution structure, and also their efforts towards achieving a circular economy by focusing on plastics, including designing for lower weight of plastics in their product. Mr. Acharya of JSW, he talked about the group being in 3 hard-to-tackle sectors. I mean, 4 hard-to-tackle sectors is steel, energy, cement, and infrastructure, all of which have major carbon footprints. And in his case, the scope 3 emissions are about, in those industries, about 3%. In the specific case of JSW, it's about 1%. And they are looking at targeting carbon neutrality, a 60% reduction by 2050, and by 2060, moving to the national goal of 2070 of zero. Mr. Amit Agrawal, Amit from BMW, He talked about the challenges facing the automotive industry. So even while we think about electric vehicles as non-polluting from a tank to wheel aspect, we also need to consider where the fuel comes from. And then upstream, where do the batteries, where do the materials being used in cars come from? And he spoke about the triangle of relationships between emissions, material, and energy. And the fact that one man's scope 3 would be somebody else's scope 1. So there is a very strong linkage. And I think that is all these, the supply chain is intertwined as far as the emissions are concerned. The automotive industry has been focusing on lightweighting, improving safety, addressing price consideration. So a couple of the interesting things that he spoke about, which we would like to know more in subsequent, is incorporating the carbon price into manufacture. And he left us with a question that the automotive industry can transform itself very fast, but is the market ready? So after the imagining question, I think I will come to these questions. Finally, Mr. Gautam, he talked about the challenges of construction, and one of the challenges is that it's a very ad hoc, very low standardization industry, and I was surprised that he commented that it's the same way in other parts of the world also. One thinks of when you see a place like Dubai, that it is highly advanced construction methods that they are using. But then the aspects of circularity that can be brought into the construction industry through repurposing, remanufacturing offer major opportunities. And he spoke briefly about Cushman and Wakefield when they do the building management. So maybe I will come back to that question about the building management aspects. It's something that maybe we can all learn something from. So let me come back to the original question. Let me ask Mr. Vipin Odekar, what do you imagine your industry and your supply chain will look like in 2050? You have to unmute, Vipin.
Yeah, sure. I think you have put everybody into an imaginary world and try to think of the most probably an ideal situation for an industry. I think that a lot of things can be done. But if you come to the practical world, I'll just try to comment on how Marico has imagined its value chain. We have not thought of till 2050, but definitely what could be the architecture of our value chain. We had done some homework. We have some program called as Samyut for our supply chain. Samyut is a Sanskrit word. Sam is all and Yut is coming together. So Samyut means we all come together, whether Marico and its business associates, and how we should move forward. That's a responsible sourcing program for Marico, for the entire value chain. What we have it, and it has got 3 legs. First level where we introduce concept of sustainability to our vendors. What is Marico's vision? What are our targets? How the world is moving? It's more like a capacity building and then giving a principal level commitment from their side. Level 2, it's a third-party audit where their commitments are seen at far larger level by auditing the premises against the sustainability practices, especially in ethical, environmental, and social area, and then taking them forward. And the last leg is the most important, where we are trying to imagine. The intention is that whatever may be the association with any business associate, what kind of emissions are creating because of that association, whether it is a service or a material buying through them, and can we do something so that identified emissions are curtailed over next few years, either through technological interventions or through knowledge building or capacity building, or do changes in our product formulation itself, so that as an association of business associates in Marico, we all can actually reduce overall scope 3 emissions pertaining to our relationships by 50%. That's how we have imagined it, and then probably there's a gradual way to do capacity building and take them in our journey of sustainability. And I could see a reduction of at least 50% in next 20, 25 years overall, because it's a long term, it's an irreversible change which we are looking at it. So it has to be done in a gradual way so that people adopt these practices, and they will adapt only if it is viable and it is long-term change for them. And that is how we would like to go for it. But we are planning to have 100% of our supply chain, at least critical suppliers, to be certified at level 3 by 2050. That's what we imagine the supply chain.
Thank you, Vipin. Let me move on to Mr. Acharya and hear from him how he imagines the.
Yeah, let me think. Let me rephrase this question for me. Is that how I think climate change is going to impact my supply chain? So in that perspective, let me answer, because I am not a supply chain expert, but obviously from this point of view, let me start with the steel. So by 2050, steel is still going to be manufactured in India with iron ore and some carbon reduction. So carbon reduction is not going to be entirely zero by 2050. So therefore, in the material, the upstream of the supply chain uh, will remain same, with importance of uh, coal supply will be reducing. Specifically thermal coal, I don't think they will exist in 2050 as a upstream supply chain for steel industry in India. So I'm putting Indian context. The other part which is going to change, because Indian context, the reason, because we will be largely be Indian focused. The steel industry is going to grow in India. It's not going to grow in anywhere in the world by 2050. The other part which is going to be significantly important in the supply chain is the scrap supply chain. And that is going to be predominant in 2050, towards 2040 and 50, which is currently almost non-existent in India. The other important supply chain which will change in 2050 is the green hydrogen supply, because as Amit, I think, touched upon about these iron productions where a reduction happens. So more and more carbon neutral reductant, and that the only candidate is hydrogen, and that has to be green hydrogen. So green hydrogen supply chain is going to be increased dramatically by 2050. So these are the significant changes in the upstream supply chain is going to possibly happen by 2050. If I go to downstream, I think my customers will be remaining the similar, because and more and more climate resilient infrastructure growth will happen. So therefore, I see there is a very good opportunity, and the sectors will grow. I will be happy that both Gautam and Amit will remain my customers because we will be producing them new green steel as much as possible. The other sector which is downstream is the renewable sector. So that significant way it is going to increase, and therefore that downstream supply chain is going to change. Now, if I look at to my energy business, there I could see a complete change. Specifically, there will be no thermal coal. Right now, if you look at in my energy business, we are generating almost 30% from renewable and 70% through thermal route. By 2030, it should be reverse. 70% renewable, 30% thermal. By 2050, it will be zero. We will not have any thermal, and we have committed to that. So therefore, there will be a significant change in my supply chain. I will not be purchasing or importing any thermal coal by 2050. I'm shopping in these two business, which are listed business, and obviously, cement will have similar story, and infrastructure will have a similar story, because importance in the coal playing the major role.
Thank you, Mr. Acharya. So let me move on to Amit. Amit, how do you imagine your industry and its supply chain will look like?
So first, I think hope we'll be around and we'll be thriving still, selling cars, and people would need cars and buy cars in 2050. Having said that, I think 2050 is not that far away, because to many people will find this surprising, but we also have architectures and platforms. It's not just the IT and technology industry, and those platforms and architectures have typically a lifetime of 10 years. So we are only 3 decisions away from making a decision that will determine what 2050 looks like. So one will be middle of the decade, next is middle of next decade, and third is middle of the decade following that. And then it's pretty much set, what the car would look like, what the supply chain would look like, and so on. we believe in 2050, if we are still talking about carbon emissions, then we would have failed as a collective. And we expect the needle to move from carbon efficiency to resource efficiency, which is in the direction of circular economy. Because I think carbon is only one part of the sustainability issue. The larger issue is, do we continue to dig up resources from Earth? Do we move to secondary materials? Do we move to bio-based materials? And how can we deliver more bang for the buck when it comes to resource usage? What I did not mention in my opening remarks was, aside of these carbon reduction targets, we also have a secondary material goal, which we published, that we want to have 50% secondary material in our cars, with the next wave of architecture and innovation. So that's going to become more and more dominant in our attention, because I think that not only saves carbon emissions. For example, if you use secondary aluminum versus primary aluminum, the emission reductions are by order of magnitude of 8 or 10. And if you use secondary steel or scrap-based steel versus primary steel, you could also have some equivalent reductions compared to existing technologies. So that's, I think, on one side. And on the other hand, I think in terms of the technology innovation, I think there'll be a new wave of technology companies coming in to help solve the problem. So I'll give you one example again in steel. We're talking about steel. So he said, Mr. Acharya mentioned that H2 is the only reducing agent, right? So we figured out that, okay, the steel industry is going to take a lot of time to transform. Now there are a couple of 2 or 3 startups in the world which are working on molten oxide electrolysis, which is a very early stage. You can literally count two companies or 3 companies in the world which are doing this. So we throw in some risk capital there. We invested in one company called Boston Metals. Maybe there are other options like that which develop in the area of carbon capture, in the area of basic steel manufacturing, in the area of metal extractions, and so on. So I think a lot of these answers to solve the issue will come along the way as we put our attention to it. So it's difficult to say exactly what mix, but definitely carbon neutral and on resource efficiency.
Thank you, Amit. And let's move on to Mr. Gautam. So Gautam, how would you imagine your industry and supply chain to be like? You need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. So it would change probably unimaginably because things have not been the same 10 years ago. So we've been moving at some pace, but the pace only will increase. By 2050, most of the things that we see today would change in at least building industry as far as the look and feel of it is concerned. Of course, even the operational side, the smart technologies, the operational technologies will also come in a big way. But as we may be aware that out of the 15 categories of scope 3 emission, supply chain, construction industry is associated with the 2 of them very majorly: purchased goods and services, and also emissions from the capital goods. So this is where a lot of things go into the embodied carbon of the building. So there are a lot of things already go into the building which have a huge embodied carbon footprint. And we multiply that during our operational phases and finally discard everything into the atmosphere. So this clearly indicates the rather confirms the nexus between the building industry, what the building industry procures and during its construction procurement stages, and also the larger scope 3 emissions. So there's a lot of linkage between scope 3 emissions and the procurement of building industry requirements. And so far, not many have bothered about connecting these 2 and then working on the decarbonizing of this section of emission. And that has never been a priority. But that's where we also witnessed recently that a lot of materials are procured from far off places, even now from far off countries, for every conceivable need. Even though most of the things are available in the country, we are somehow obsessed with buying foreign goods. This has been a cultural problem. For example, India imports at least say 15% of building materials from China every year, and some 7 to 10% of building materials from the US, and some another equally some 7 to 8% from Middle East, and equally from countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Italy, UK, Belgium. So all these have been supplying lot of components and various types of building materials for this year, and together they account for almost 40% of all construction materials we use, at least in the major metro cities. So this obviously adds to something called material miles. Like we have food miles, these are the material miles that are added, and this adds to makes up the most of the embodied carbon in these buildings. So the transportation emissions related to transportation. Hence, of late, the manufacturing hubs, some of the manufacturing hubs of most of the manufacturing industries in the construction sector have moved their bases to India mostly. So they are somewhere near the southern or the middle of the country, somewhere in Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh kind of things. And this considerably has reduced the distance or the transportation related emissions to an extent. There is also a considerable push from the government given the indigenously sourced materials and components that demonstrated the importance of global supply chain. Because recently during the pandemic, the supply chain has went high and dry. Most of the supply chain got impacted by pandemic related restrictions and lockdowns. Construction activities, even though they were allowed to function, they came to grounding halt because a lot of these components were still missing from the supply chain. So if the materials are now sourced locally, regionally, and then there is a way we can avoid at least majority of these imports, and we are self-reliant in this part of the business, and that would go a long way. And that's what we'll see in the next coming up in the next 2 to 3 decades. Though there are ways to actually reduce the need of these materials in the first place, that's another subject for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Gautam. Now I'll come to questions which are more specific to your industry. So first to Vipin, that agriculture and farming is the base for your raw material, and therefore water becomes a very important commodity. And could you talk a little bit about Marico's initiatives to ensure continued availability of water for processes and addressing the issue of water in your supply chain?
Yeah, thank you. See, if you look at India's footprint, so we actually receive sufficient amount of monsoon as a country level. But the problem is that we do not have sufficient conservation capacities to collect that water and make it usable for domestic purpose. The usage of water, if you do a pan-India distribution, around 80% of water is used for farming purpose, around 10 to 15% for domestic purpose. Domestic and industrial is actually mixed, so the industrial purpose is increasing. But majority of the water is going for a farming purpose. And hence it is important that we create those capacities so that we can capture rainwater and then make it available for farming and other purposes. In water, there is a concept called as green water, blue water, and green water, gray water. So we have created, I could say, a policy for each type of thing, so that we are very clear about what is the purpose and where we are going to work. Green water is rainwater, so capturing of rainwater is important and making it available, whether it is inside your operation or whether for the society. So we have a program called a Jalashay, where we are working pan-India to create conservation capacities for rainwater. So whether we started with Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, we worked in Madhya Pradesh, we worked in Uttar Pradesh. So wherever there is a need, there are low rainfed areas, or if the lakes are there, old lakes are there, and then its capacity is reduced because of the silt, etc. So we carry out creation of farm ponds or desilting operations so that that capacity is available for rainwater. So till date, around 215 billion water is capacities are created and it is made available to the society. Moving to the next phase, which is a blue water, which is the water which is surface water, which is available to people and which normally used in industry also, groundwater. So water intensity reduction is an important area, and then predominantly it can happen through process improvements. So over the years, a lot of interventions are taken to reduce the water intensity, and around 67% of water intensity is reduced in last 7-8 years. And there are few more chances to adopt. I think we have identified to go further and reduce it. Within our own factory, we have a rainwater harvesting pond, which can actually cater to 30% of the annual water requirement of that unit. And all the effluent, which we call it as a rainwater, is completely treated and taken back in the system, either for an industrial purpose or for the domestic purpose. So overall, I think we have to go for water neutrality. One of our unit is already water neutral. And if the industry actually takes a commitment of water neutrality and ensure that there is no additional consumption and we are not depriving society for usage of this water, that could be the first commitment. And second is definitely we should create a huge amount of capacities, because monsoon is not a problem, but the conservation of water and making it available to domestic and farming purposes is something which we are working on. And it's a commitment that 100% of water consumption, what we do in our operations, equivalent capacities will be created across pan India. And that will have a continuous commitment over the years. We'll try to do those things in the coming years.
Thank you, Bipin. We are now asked Mr. Acharya. He spoke about the scrap supply chain becoming a dominant presence in the future. So could you talk a little bit about JSW's initiatives in this regard, the recycling and scrap supply chain area?
Okay, thank you, Avram. Let me a little bit give you what JSW is doing basically to decarbonize the iron and steel sector and what role the scrap is going to play. Because for steel sector, there is no single solutions to decarbonize, and it has to be a multiple approaches. And again, I just want to clarify everybody, in iron and steel sector, you will not have even theoretically a zero emission scenario. So what we are talking about, net zero. Why I'm telling, let me explain. Even we completely eliminate iron making process, that is where the scrap comes. We completely take all scraps and melt it in an electric arc furnace and source the power from green energy, in theory, 100%. But still you will be using electrodes. So there would be emissions, right? So what we are talking about, therefore this net zero is important, that we should not add in the net to the emissions. Now, on the iron making, which is the main process by which the CO2 emissions comes, the multiple ways, one big candidate is hydrogen reductions, where you make iron through hydrogen and then you melt it to steel, or you capture and store. And that's where JSW, I just wanted to keep you informed, JSW is already operating 100 ton per day carbon capture and utilization, and we are looking at scaling it up. The other ways could be, as Amit told, about direct smelting or even adding biocarbon. So those are the other alternatives to make iron in a cleaner way so that you can melt it to the steel. And that is where scrap becomes very important. And we expect, if you look at, India is growing since last 40-50 years. And steel once made to become scrap, it takes almost 30 to 40 years to come back as a scrap. So therefore, we have to give that space for the availability of scrap in India. Now coming to question of yours, what JSW is doing. So we are having two approach to increase scrap availability in our facility. The first part is that, of course, you use from more internal sources, whatever scrap is used, you completely 100% use those, take each bit of that. Second part, you work on the supply chain, establish supply chain, including collection centers, and then processing centers. At this moment, I would like to be there that we are working on that part without divulging much details, which are still not in public domain. But yes, our effort will be to support the national policy, scrap policy, to be an integral part, start on our own, because right now our scraps are being imported mostly, either generated through internal resources or being imported. So how we can work with the scrap supply chain in the country and be a part and be a facilitator in getting those as much as possible, so that we can reduce dependence on the primary processes.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that gives us a good understanding of the alternatives available to the steel industry. The question for Amit, that is, how you talked about incorporating the carbon price. So how do you go about doing that when you manufacture your product?
Sure. So I think carbon pricing is a quite fascinating and complicated topic. But just to give a perspective on this, if you look at the headline numbers, let's say you look at the European ETS markets, you will see a price of 40 euros per ton of carbon or 50 euros per ton of carbon. Similarly, you look at Sweden or a couple of other countries, you will find absurdly high numbers on carbon taxes or equivalent, right? But the interesting metric to look at is reports from the World Bank or IMF, which basically give you the yield on carbon trading. And that is more in the range of 2 euros, 3 euros per ton today. And the reason is there's a lot of leakage in the market because there are free allowances given to industries, also the steel industry, and for genuine reasons. Because if you impose carbon taxes or carbon prices in a certain political or customs regime, and you don't have a carbon border adjustment, then the domestic industry faces competition from the importers, right? So, or the exporters. And that leads to imbalances, and therefore you have free allowances. And those things are kind of getting changed, and what we see is carbon markets are getting more and more integrated. So that's the external picture. Now, when you look at the internal picture, all the carbon pricing anyway gets embedded into the commodities that we buy because the suppliers price it into their products. Coming to our internal view, when we look at these targets that I mentioned, let's say minus 80% by 2030, minus 20% by 2030 over 2019 baselines, all the execution of this target is based on a so-called carbon abatement curve, where you say, I reduce XYZ quantity of carbon at a certain cost, certain price. So therefore, we do have that. And any organization with a target on carbon reduction would have an abatement curve. And that's incorporated in our decision making. The interesting thing about carbon and economics right now, and which also I noticed in your invitation for the panel, is if you look at the initial reduction of emissions, it's an economic as well as ecological opportunity. So if I divide the number of emissions that Greenco helped save in India by the amount of money that was saved, it comes to about almost 10,000 rupees per ton of emissions saved annually. So for us, it's anyway a natural economic opportunity to some extent. Then the carbon prices kick in externally, then it becomes also sensible to do it. But the last leg, the last 5-10% of emissions, which Mr. Acharya also mentioned, like emissions coming from graphite anodes, for example, are the really hard ones to abate, where we have to look for very different kind of solutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit. I'd like to ask Mr. Gautam, talk a little bit on the building management aspect and how that can help in addressing the opportunities towards net zero. And please unmute. And
Sure. So this is a matter of long debate because however green a building is made, because earlier we thought that getting a building certified as green is good enough and we don't have to do anything more than that or after that. But then little realizing that getting a building designed and certified green is just the beginning, because more than 80% of the emissions are attributed to the building's operations life. So that's where the elephant is in the room. And normally these buildings are operated though by technical staff, but not of much good practices are being followed as far as greening of those practices are concerned. In fact, most of the building operational staff or even the employees, sometimes we found through various surveys that they are not even aware that a building is specifically certified as a green, whether it is LEED or IGBC, platinum, gold. They are most unaware, and then even if they are aware, they don't know what is in it for them, and then how does it matter for them. So it is a matter of concern that the users and the operational staff of the buildings are given enough sensitization or enough orientation about how a building is run. That's the primary thing, because behavioral aspect is contributing to a majority chunk of these emissions, whether it is excess electrical utilization or wastage of water or food or materials. These are all stemming from the fact that mentally we are not prepared to adopt that kind of uh, low carbon lifestyle. But that's changing slowly, not to worry, but that has to be faced up. The second aspect is the management aspect, which is mostly dependent on technology. So there are, we have buildings, most of the current day buildings are equipped with the modern building management systems, but the integration is lacking. It's incomplete in the sense that we tend to override the automation, and then most of the time, in order to meet the individual requirements of either employees or the staff, we tend to override those algorithms and then have this manual interpretation or interference. That's leading to some kind of what you call technology not doing anything for us. So in building management systems, whether it is technology or the operational practices or the behavioral patterns, it's the orientation that is lacking. There are technologies, at least to an extent, available even in India, commercially available, that can be actually be put to use, and those will help to reduce the energy consumption or water utilization by at least 40%. And that in turn will, of course, attribute to direct and indirect emissions, scope 2 probably. But that's where we need a lot of push from the clients. And then a lot of education and awareness are also required in this way, in this field. And we, as one of the companies in the real estate consulting field, are trying our best to push this factor. We have been lining up a lot of training sessions and awareness sessions, road shows of late. Thanks to COVID, a lot of things can happen virtually. A lot of people are able to be pulled in. There is a big global team of experts who come in frequently and bring this knowledge from across different countries. That's what is the current situation.
Thank you. May I quickly check with Shiny? Do we have any questions from the audience?
So yes, so there's a question to Mr. Amit. Mr. Amit mentioned about BMW's plan of 50% secondary materials. So there's a question saying, how do you envision the collection, processing, and availability of these secondary materials?
Thank you. I think that's a very, very pertinent question, because if you look at just the number of cars sold 20 years back, they were like half the volume of the cars sold today. So even if you take all that and process the scrap, you would not have enough materials to meet those goals. I think what we're looking for is an open loop system where we're looking at working with recyclers, we're looking at working with steel manufacturers, aluminum manufacturers, plastics manufacturers, and so on, to increase the supply of these materials and to do it at the right quality. So I think the issue is not so much quantity which can be solved for, but the quality. And recycling and scrap being more labor intensive, there's a lot of contamination on the way. So we really need to relook at it in a very different manner and find either processes or technologies that assure the quality that we need with the quantity that we have. Quantity you cannot change. And there we have a couple of innovation cooperation projects with our ecosystem.
Thank you, Mr. Amit. Sir, there's also a question for Mr. Bipin.
Yeah.
So the question says, unless there's a demand for sustainability products in the market, it is difficult to get the products moving. So how does Marico address this and influence your customers?
Good. I think someone in the panel also said that we need to also check whether the market is ready for any change. I think Amit said it. See, you're right. So it is not related to only FMCG product. I think this movement or a product or services, I think whether the market is ready for that is a question to everybody. But what we could see is that whenever we are going for campuses, the younger generation is far more sensitive than our generation towards sustainability, and there is a very high amount of pull. If you look at the new generation, and if you look at the e-commerce or modern trade, I think these people are the highest number of buyers in these two platforms in the supply chain. And then in these two platforms, if you look at the queries which are getting or the consumer feedbacks we are receiving, actually it is increasing for sustainability, very encouraging. And people are asking questions about what is the footprint of your product, or what kind are you working on recycling of your product? Is your packaging recycling? So a lot of queries are coming up with the new generation, and then consumers are giving. And whenever we are sharing our initiatives to them, we are getting very good feedback from them. So I think we are actually at the time where things are getting momentum, and it's up to us that how we promote these things through responsible marketing, and ensure that the consumer offerings and benefits are communicated to them through various channels. It is going to pick up. We need to hold our hands and continue our journey to ensure that the products are in sustainable form, reaching to them. Probably I could see another 5 to 10 years, there would be more demand of sustainable products in India also. Till that time, we should be ready with their expectations. That's what I think we should commit as of now today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vipin. Please continue, Shani.
If we may take one more question.
Yes.
Yes. So the next question is to Mr. Acharya. The question says, JSW Group into major sectors like power, cement, and steel. How do you look at R&D and investments towards net zero?
Thank you, Shani. I think that's a very good question has been put because innovation and R&D are going to be the key in developing a near zero product and processes. And that is where, as far as JSW is concerned, this is very important for us. We not only do those on our own, but you understand in these sectors, a lot of collaborations is needed. And one of the good example I can see, like in the steel, we have a collaborations with JFE, and we work together. Similarly, you would have seen that JSW is one of the founder for India Hydrogen Association, and also we have collaborated with Fortescue for producing green hydrogen in India. And there also we are right now in the process of collaborating with the various organizations, how we can scale it up. So, I mean, what I can tell that that's very important, and it is one of the essential part. And we believe that research and development is key in this hard to abate sector to decide who will be the leader.
Thank you, sir. Chairman, if we may ask just one last question to the other speaker, with your
Yes.
permission.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Gautam, the question that was asked for you is, with the building sector or the construction sector, which is more of an unorganized sector, owing to the circular economy aspects, how do you look at the construction and demolition waste being put back into the cycle?
Thanks for the question. I think that's very timely. There have been a lot of efforts by the government during the Swachh Sarvekshan exercises to tackle the municipal waste, including C&D waste. This has been one of the areas that have not been given the priority that it required. C&D waste comes in very many forms and sizes, and that's where, again, as you said, as the question, when whoever asked the question has said, it is in very disorganized and in a much disarray. in the sense that there is no particular professional way of demolishing the building in the first place. In fact, we have seen this Maradu case in Kerala recently, where 160 or around 300 units were demolished overnight in a fraction of seconds because they have violated certain lake buffer zone regulations. Keeping aside the regulations part of it, there should be a way of demolishing these buildings scientifically so that every cubic feet of that material can actually be recycled. So that is not yet been there in the industry. I think efforts are on, but at least whatever we could salvage from the building when it is demolished or decommissioned has to be put back into the cycles. So that's happening to an extent in the probably cement industry or to an extent in the concrete industry where most of the recycled aggregate is being used. To an extent in the paint industry also, recycled paint. And of course, iron is being one of the major areas of recycling. 98% of iron can actually be salvaged from a demolished building. And I can also, I think Mr. Acharya can vouch for that, that 95% of the steel currently is recycled. I mean, the steel we are using probably is from centuries old. I mean, we have been using it again and again, though we also mine fresh iron ore, which means that there are ways of putting back the C&D waste back into the system, but then there has not been any professional or what you call systematic efforts or even coherent efforts. I mean, there are regulations coming up, if I understand from the government, that they would restrict the amount of C&D waste that goes out of a particular project. So we are supposed to recycle and use 95% of that waste within the project, and only 5% is allowed to go out. So there could be some regulations that will help put in this process or system in place. And of course, the startups and technologies will probably aid the expedition of this size.
Thank you, Mr. Gautam. Over to you, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Shiny. And I think we are just in time to wrap up this very interesting panel discussion. I think it was quite enriching to get the perspectives from 4 widely different industries: Marico, BMW, Cushman & Wakefield, and JSW. Thank you all for your participation. I'm sure that our audience would leave the session much enriched and educated about the journey to net zero that each of these industries are taking, and the part that each of us has to play. One message, if I can say, it comes through is that no industry is alone, and we all have to work together to make each other successful in this journey. So thank you very much. We will conclude the session. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Shiny, for being the co-host. And thank you to Greenco for putting the session together.
Thank you so much. On behalf of CI, we would like to thank the chairman and the panelists for this wonderful session. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day and good weekend.
Thank you. You too. A quick announcement to the audience. The next session would start at 11:30. We have 2 sessions running in parallel. One parallel session would focus on net zero carbon and the other one would focus on water and waste. We would request all of you to use the CI Hive login platform and log into your respective sessions. Thank you.